Unfortunately, the sports ecosystem today is still very much designed with boys in mind.
How can we better support athletes, not just in their pursuit of becoming great champions and maybe attaining the goal, but in protecting their mental health and building a sense of purpose beyond sports?
Yeah, mental health is an issue. Athletes deal with it just like everybody's dealing with it. But athletes have a role to play in terms of showing that it can be overcome. And often purpose can be a great way of doing that. So, the athletes, I think, that are able to be most successful in overcoming those mental health challenges have a bigger purpose than just winning medals. My hope is that sport will recognize that it has a bigger role to play in society than just providing entertainment and making athletes and owners wealthy, and that sport can become a solution or a platform for which we can drive solutions for some of the world's biggest challenges and problems.
Welcome to the 1 Million Years of Joy podcast. I'm Dr. Andrea Vanacker, your host, and my intention is to inspire you to find more joy in your life through the stories from our guests and the science on joy and purpose. Neill, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Likewise. Thank you, Andrea. Good to be here.
Neill, you have had an incredible career at the intersection of sports and social impact. Can you share a little about your journey and what led you to this path and the creation of 17 Sport? And what role does joy play in that mission?
Sure. Where to start? I guess it all goes back to when I lived in South Africa. I actually trained to become a chartered accountant. But I also played rugby and was also born into a horse racing family in Zimbabwe and got the opportunity to become a sports broadcaster on horse racing at a very young age. And after I qualified as an accountant, I realized that I actually didn't want to do that. And that what I really wanted to do was to find a way to combine my passion for sport and the media, but also not just throw my training down the drain and trying to find a way to use that as well. And so I kind of naively decided after that to set up a sports marketing business, not really knowing what it was about, but it seemed like a good time to be doing it because South Africa was just coming out of its isolation period. So this is back in the early 90s, just when Nelson Mandela had been released from prison and South Africa was being reintroduced into the international community. And after having been seen as an outsider from international sport, all of a sudden everybody in the world wanted to come to South Africa. So it was a very exciting time where, the Rainbow Nation was being born. Sport was at the top of the agenda. And so I figured, well, why not just lean into that and take advantage of it? So that's where it all started. And after battling for the first couple of years to figure out what the space was that I was going to focus on within sport, what I recognized is that there were people that were buying sponsorship, there were people selling sponsorship, there were people communicating around sponsorship. But believe it or not, nobody back then was actually advising corporations on how they should be approaching or using sport as a business tool. Sport was still very much the kind of purview of the chairman or the chairperson, mainly the chairman back then. And if the chairman's daughter rode ponies, the company would sponsor show jumping. And that was kind of, without too much of a stretch, that was really how a lot of sport was, and sports sponsorship was followed. So what I tried to do was to introduce my business training with my love of the media and my love of sport together to show how sport could be used as a business platform or a business tool. So I started doing the work, started to get some traction, and started to also realize that there was an interesting opportunity to use sport as a platform to solve some of the challenges that South Africa was facing at the time. So because of its history, the majority of the population, the black people living in South Africa at the time, had been denied things like access to education, healthcare, housing, just pretty basic things, right? And there was a huge catch-up that needed to happen in order to try and level the playing field for all citizens of South Africa. And so I started to think about, well, how could we use sport as a tool to drive some of that agenda? And what we started to notice was that when we worked with partners that shared that view, the sponsorships that we put together worked better than the ones that were just taking the traditional approach. Surprise, surprise, right? When you look back on it now, it's kind of obvious, right? And why? Because sponsorships being used in a way that was more relevant to the community and the environment and the culture at the time. And so continued to follow that model and built the business on the back of that. And we grew very quickly. And at one stage, we were the fourth largest communication services group in the country, despite the fact that we were purely focused just on sponsorship. And got a knock on the door one day from the Interpublic Group, who are one of the big communication services holding companies in the world. They own things like McCann Erickson and Lowe Group and Weber Shandwick and those type of people. And they were in the process of creating a sports marketing group. And we're going around the world identifying the leaders in each of the markets and basically acquiring them to create this thing called Octagon. And so we were fortunate. They looked at us as, a suitable partner for that exercise. And so we became part of the Octagon Group worldwide. And that opened up the international stage to the work that we were doing. And one thing led to another, and I was offered the opportunity to move to Europe to take on the role of president of Octagon Europe, Middle East, Africa, based out of Brussels, which seemed like an exciting opportunity, particularly because I thought I could take this model that we developed in South Africa of essentially impact-driven sponsorship and start to apply that to the rest of the world. But after having been in that role for 2 years, I realized that one, Europe, which was my focus, wasn't ready for that conversation. And two, Octagon wasn't ready for that conversation. Why? Because at the time, so this is back in 2006, at the time, what I noticed was that the corporate sector really regarded or had a view that it was the responsibility of government to address social issues in society, not the role of the corporate sector. And so that people just didn't get it. They just didn't understand, why they needed to be doing that, because that was something that government should be doing. So I decided that I was so passionate about the opportunity that I would leave Octagon and go and try and have build some case studies to show that this model worked outside of Africa. So I left Octagon, went off on my own, and had the opportunity to work on some interesting projects like the 34th America's Cup, which was happening in San Francisco. And through that event, together with the team there, we had the opportunity to build a program which was called More Than a Sport. And we used the America's Cup as a platform to raise awareness and action around ocean health. A sailing event, the oceans are in trouble. And so how could we use this event as a platform to shine a light on this issue and get people to start taking action around it? And it worked. We built a commercial program around it. And I think it became probably one of the first 2 or 3 impact-led global sports projects. And now I had my case study. We applied the same model to Super Bowl 50. I was invited to be part of that team. And in that case, the insight was that a third of the population in the Bay Area live in poverty. Can you believe it? The home of the likes of Facebook and Apple and all these companies, but yet 2.5 million people technically living in poverty. How could we use the Super Bowl as a platform to uplift those people with a focus on young people and helping them to overcome the opportunity gap? Anyway, cut a long story short, by leading with that purpose, Super Bowl 50 became the most shared, the most commercially successful, the most purposeful, the most everything Super Bowl in history, and really became a case study of how to do impact-led sponsorship in the international world, in other words, outside of Africa. And that really is what gave me the confidence to set up 17 Sport, because 6 or 7 years after leaving Octagon, I had enough proof of concept to show people that this stuff actually works, and it was that time to take that model to the world. And so provided the impetus to launch 17 Sport with my partner Fabien Paget. Fabien was doing similar work, but on the athlete side. He'd worked with a number of high-profile athletes, including Serena Williams. And Fabien had helped Serena to recognize that the Serena Williams brand was more than just about tennis. And as we know now, Serena's become a champion for women's empowerment. And Fabien helped her to figure that out and to build her non-tennis brand and to get some great commercial partners on board to help her do that. And so we figured out we could do more together than we were doing alone. And so we joined forces and launched 17 Sport just before COVID. And that's how it came about.
Thank you so much, Neill, for sharing your journey, which is absolutely beautiful. And I want to dive into a topic that relates to gender inequality in sports that still remains a systemic issue, with barriers like lack of access, representation, and cultural stigma keeping many women and girls on the sidelines. In your work, I know that you have seen the ripple effects of empowering women in sports that can actually extend beyond the field. Can you tell us more about the stories and the impact that your company has had since inception to actually break down these barriers?
Yep, it's a very real problem that you talk about. I mean, the research will show you that girls drop out of sport at a younger age than boys. Why? Because of all the things that you just mentioned. You know, and it happens at so many different levels, from a systemic level, just in terms of opportunities to play sport. Unfortunately, the sports ecosystem today is still very much designed with boys in mind. And just simple things, and think like, and we've had this whole debate in the US around access to change rooms, for example. That's just one example. There aren't, in many sports facilities, there aren't different change rooms for girls and boys. So as a young girl, why would you want to go and play sport if there isn't a place for you to shower or go to the restroom or go to the toilet around? Things like the equipment that you use. Equipment is designed with boys in mind. Things like the cleats that girls get to play with, they have to use the same cleats that boys use, but their feet and their bodies are designed differently. Think about menstruation and the impact that has as young girls start menstruating. That creates complications that boys don't have to deal with. And so it's another reason for girls just to say, well, this is just too complicated, I'm not going to play sport. So there are a whole range of things that come out of this. And actually, through one of our most important projects, which is called the Adidas Breaking Barriers for Girls project, we've done a fair amount of research into these topics. And we're actually using that research to inform the type of solutions that we put in place now to try and keep girls active in sport and having great success. So the project that I mentioned is now just completed its 5th year. It was born out of a recognition that Adidas had, that their stated purpose as a company is to improve people's lives through sport, but that they weren't necessarily doing that when it came to the people front. They have had a lot of success on the planet side of things, really focusing on their supply chain and looking at how they reduce their environmental footprint out of making the stuff that they make. But they recognize that they could do a better job when it came to working with people. And so they tasked us with helping them to figure out how could they build a program that could actually be a demonstration of their commitment to their purpose. And that's how the Breaking Barriers project was born. And so 5 years on, we've now directly improved the lives of 75,000 girls through this program. In other words, 75,000 girls have now stayed in sport as a consequence of this initiative. And we've done that by working with organizations at a grassroots level that are providing opportunities for girls to play sport to help them to better serve girls. So in other words, if an organization might have been just focused on boys, we've worked on them now to figure out how do they need to provide different types of avenues, pathways, programs, so that girls can actually participate and stay in sport. We also identified and supported 100 local champions in the community who we've helped become role models and coaches to inspire other girls to stay in sport. And so that's one example, of the type of work that we've done to address this issue. We're also working with individual athletes, Paralympic athletes, for example, or Olympic athletes, providing them with a platform to better tell their story, again, to serve as an inspiration to other girls to stay in sport, because there's a famous saying, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And so we work very hard to create opportunities for girls to become role models, women athletes to become role models to keep the girls in sport or to inspire them to participate in sport. So things like that, are a demonstration of the type of work that we're doing in this area.
I love that, and congratulations on these beautiful accomplishments. It's just so incredible to see the positive impact that your efforts are making. And I was wondering if you can maybe share with us a story that has marked you, emerging from your efforts at 17 Sport, that has made a key impact, particularly as it relates and connects to the topic of this podcast that is all about joy. Is there a story that has truly moved you in the last couple of years that you can maybe share with our audience?
Yeah, there are so many, Andrea, and it's what keeps me going every day, to be honest, because it's not easy. We are working at the fringes of sport. Unfortunately, sport is still very dominated by what I call the Jerry Maguire factor. I don't know if you saw the film Jerry Maguire, but show me the money.
Yeah.
That is at the heart of sports DNA, and it's still I don't know whether it's 90% or 85% or 80%, but the bulk of sport still is driven by that money metric. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to transform the business model around sport into a more purposeful one. So every day is an uphill battle. Every day you've got to convince people that there's a better way to do things. And we're having success at that, but that wouldn't, the energy that I and the team require in order to do that is driven, it or comes from the stories that we're part of every day, that we see happening in front of us every day through the work that we do. And I mean, the Adidas Breaking Barriers project is one example of that. There's a young woman by the name of Leanne. I won't give her a surname, but Leanne comes from a very difficult background. She was denied access to opportunities to play sport, despite the fact that she's wanted to do, that's what she wanted to do. She had to play as part of a boys' soccer team when she was young because there wasn't a girls' soccer team for her to play in. So I met Leanne in the first year of the Breaking Barriers project. She became one of our champions. And it's just been every year we have a gathering where we bring together all the champions and all the nonprofit organizations and all the different stakeholders that are participating in the Breaking Barriers project. We convene once a year just to reflect on where we've come from, where we're going, and to celebrate what's been achieved. And it gives me great joy every year to meet up with Leanne and see how she's grown as an individual and how she's blossomed into this amazing young person that has an exciting future ahead of her because of this project. And that might not have been the case if we hadn't done what we've done, and if this intervention hadn't applied. And so if you multiply that by 75,000 times at various different degrees, right? Because not everybody benefits the same way or takes out of the project what they can at the same level. But just, to see the Leannes of the world and how they benefit out of this brings me great joy.
Wonderful. You spoke about a movie earlier, and I want to connect the dots with a movie that I thought was quite intriguing, which was called The Weight of Gold, which highlights the immense pressure that athletes face and the mental health challenges that often go unnoticed. The Olympics and other world championships are a powerful symbol of bringing the world together in a peaceful competition. Yet they can also magnify these pressures. From your perspective, how can we better support athletes, not just in their pursuit of becoming great champions and maybe attaining the goal, but in protecting their mental health and building a sense of purpose beyond sports?
Yeah, the whole topic of athletes is really interesting. I saw some numbers the other day. There were two graphs, one from the 1950s and one from the 2000 with the current era that we're in. Mm-hmm. And the influencers back in 2050 were entertainers. Athletes were maybe made up 5% of influencers. Whereas if you look at it today, athletes make up, I think it's as high as 70 or 80% of influencers are athletes, which is really interesting. So, athletes have a huge role to play in driving the change that we think needs to happen, and are starting to recognize, more and more of them are starting to recognize that they have that opportunity and they have that responsibility and are embracing it, which is great. But a lot of athletes don't know how to do that. So, what we try to do, we manage a small portfolio of athletes within 17 Sport. One of them, for example, is a young Paralympian Team USA athlete called Ezra Freck. Ezra he just turned 19. He just won double gold at Paris. And from the age of 10, has been on a mission to normalize disability. So he recognizes that his role in society, in the world, the reason that he's here in the world is not just to win gold medals, but also to use his platform to raise awareness around disability as an issue and to try and normalize it. And so the role that we play with Ezra in that situation is to support him, to enable him to do that by surrounding him with corporate partners that care about and want to help him amplify that mission, but also giving him the support that he needs so that he can do that with confidence and have the strength of character to be able to do that. And so it's that type of support, I think, that is invaluable for athletes as they go through this journey. Athletes are no different to other young people, right? Mental health is a pandemic right now. Athletes are not alone in this battle that they face. But again, coming back to that point, if you can't see it, you can't be it. if the athletes that are strong and that can overcome these mental health challenges can become a great example to the rest of society, the rest of young people, that it is possible to overcome these difficulties and to break through and to still be successful. But it takes resilience, it takes character, and they can become examples of how to draw on that in order to address this issue. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question 100%, but yeah, mental health is an issue. Athletes deal with it just like everybody's dealing with it. But athletes have a role to play in terms of showing that it can be overcome. And often purpose can be a great way of doing that. So, the athletes, I think, that are able to be most successful in overcoming those mental health challenges have a bigger purpose than just winning medals. And we are seeing that the most successful athletes are the ones that actually have that purpose. And I think that's where the magic sauce rests in addressing this topic.
Great. And how do you see the role of sports evolving in the next decade?
How would I like to see it evolve, or how do I think it's going to evolve?
Yes, both. Please share both views.
Yeah, I think it's there are a lot of interesting things happening in sport right now. Women's sport is one example. So there's been an explosion of interest in women's sport. We're seeing for the first time ever women's sport starting to be taken seriously by broadcasters, and because of that, by sponsors. And why? Because more and more fans are interested in women's sport. And why is that? Because I think women's sport offers a different value proposition to men's sport. The women athletes tend to be a lot more accessible. They tend to be a lot more human. They come across anyway as a lot more human. They're a lot more real. And so younger generations particularly are starting to gravitate towards women's sport. So my hope is that women's sport will start to show that there's a different way of doing sport, and that sport as a whole will start to latch onto that and will start to reinvent itself as playing a more meaningful role in society. But there is a risk that women's sport won't do that, because as women's sport starts to grow, the money is starting to now come into women's sport. We're starting to see venture capital, private equity, venture capital, that space starting to show a real interest in women's sport. And I hope that they don't. I guess women's sports at a crossroads. It can either continue to go along the path that it started on, where it's offering something more than traditional sport, or it can fall into the trap of just becoming like the rest of sport and following the money. And so I think the next couple of years are going to be really interesting to see what happens on that front. But my hope is that sport will recognize that it has a bigger role to play in society than just providing entertainment and making athletes and owners wealthy. And that sport can become a solution or a platform for which we can drive solutions for some of the world's biggest challenges and problems. And if it does that, I think its future is bright and rosy. If it doesn't, I think it's going to find it challenging to just continue growing. It's sport. If sport's not careful, it's going to become subject to the same challenges that the rest of society faces. We can't just keep growing year on year on year on year, chasing growth for growth's sake. There's a limit to that, right? There's a limit of resources. There's a limit of everything to make that possible. So my hope is that sport recognizes that it needs to redefine its role in society in order to remain relevant. And I always think about, just to end off, I always think back to when COVID hit and sport was shut down because it was not considered to be an essential service. So I don't know if you remember that. The whole of sport shut down, professional sport shut down, because it wasn't perceived to have a role in a pandemic-driven world. And so that's the risk, is that in a world of the future, challenged by climate change, these immense social issues that we face, will it continue to remain relevant in its current form, or will it need to redefine itself in order to remain relevant and continue to grow and become an important segment in society? That's the crossroads that I think we're at.
And if you could make one small change in the sports industry tomorrow, what would it be and why?
I think I would want to redefine, it comes back to what we've just spoken about. I want to redefine what success means. Success has the metrics of success in sport now are about winning and about the return on investment from a financial perspective. I'd want to redefine success to be those things, plus also the positive impact on society that sport is having. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think you can do good and do well in sport. And so that's the change that I'd want to see. I'd want to see those definitions of success redefined to have a multiple bottom line as opposed to a singular bottom line.
Beautiful. And I want to talk about joy. If there would be one recipe for joy, what would be the three main ingredients in your view?
So I think the first thing would be for and I don't know if you're asking that question at an individual level, at a generic sport level, but I think they're kind of connected. I think the first thing is in order to experience joy, you need to have a purpose. And you need to be clear on what that purpose is and understand how your actions are contributing towards achieving that purpose. So that would be the first thing. So why? Why you exist either as an individual or as an organization. Secondly, how you're going to go about, in my case, I believe sport is a powerful platform to serve that purpose. So figure out which elements of sport you're going to lean into in order to be able to live that purpose. And at an individual level, that might be at a participation level. So how are you going to participate in sport to contribute towards being more purposeful? Or at an organizational level, how are you going to embrace sport as a platform to drive that purpose? And then finally, what are you going to do specifically in order to see those outcomes come to fruition? So using Simon Sinek's model, why, how, what? I think if you can figure out those three things and use sport as a catalyst to drive that, then I think that'll bring you joy.
Wonderful. And what's a piece of advice or mantra that you live by that has guided you through your life to date?
I think the notion of doing good while doing well has been a key driver. I don't understand why anybody wouldn't want to do that. I mean, why wouldn't you want to do good in the world if you can also continue to do well? I always say that I'm no use to anybody, my family, society at large, my company, if I'm living under a bridge. So in order for me to be most impactful and most biggest contributor to a world that works, I need to do well. And if I'm doing well, then I can do good. And so that's the kind of mantra that I live by. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think you can achieve more by putting those two things together than you can by pursuing just one of them on their own. And so that's the kind of mantra that drives me.
And given the various countries you have lived in and that you represent athletes in different parts of the world, what have you learned about joy from different cultures?
You're asking me a whole lot of questions I haven't thought about before, Andre. I wonder if there is a difference. At the end of the day, we're all humans, despite whichever country we come from or whatever culture we live in. And I think joy is a basic human. I mean, I think everybody is in search of happiness. Is joy a fundamental driver of happiness? Yeah, I think it must be. And maybe it's just the expression of joy that differs from one culture to the next. Yeah, it's a deep question that I haven't thought of before. I think if I just try and break it down, when I visit countries like India, I see joy at a much more fundamental level than it is in countries or cultures like America, for example. Maybe it's in places like India, it's simpler. It's joy is found in simpler things than in places like more, I don't know what the right word is to use, but more first world countries where things tend to be more complicated. But at the end of the day, joy still comes from simple things, even within those environments. I'm not giving you a good answer here.
No, that's fine. Thank you for those perspectives. And what's one small action someone listening today could take to use sports or their own passions as a force for good in their community so we can bring more joy to this world?
I think it would just, I would start off with, again, not a simple answer, but ask yourself the question: do you want to drive joy individually within your family, within your community, within your company, or through your company? But try and figure out what's the one area where you can have the greatest impact. and then really double down on that. Not everybody has the opportunity to do what I do, to work with multinational companies that have big budgets that are able to make a difference at scale. But everybody has the opportunity to do something that could either affect, as I said, their family or the community that they live in. And so just trying to identify that one space where you can have an impact. And then once you've identified what it is, just lean into it and see it through.
Wonderful. Any final words of wisdom, Neill, that you wish to share with our audience?
I don't think so. I think you stretched me enough already today on this
Yes?
call.
All right, Neill, it's been an immense pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you so much. And keep bringing your positivity into this world and into the arenas of this world, because it's just so beautiful to see the positive impact that your company has had to date. So absolutely love that. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you too. And thank you for what you do with your work.